You know, we talk a lot about AI alignment in these big, almost philosophical terms. But what happens when AI agents actually leave the chat window and start operating in the real world? A really insightful post from Rooted Layers gives us a new way to frame this whole problem. It argues that we need to move away from just thinking about safety prompts and start thinking like engineers with a practical blueprint. The main idea? Real agent safety isn't about some abstract alignment, it's about architecture.
So we all know this picture, right? A large language model sitting inside a simple chat interface. It feels safe. It feels contained, predictable. The boundaries are crystal clear, and the risks seem, well, pretty manageable. But as the post points out, this is just the squeaky clean, controlled demo version.
Because the moment you give that model new capabilities, the power to read your files, to call different tools, to remember things over time, you're not just dealing with the same system anymore. You've created something fundamentally new. And according to this research, that's where the real danger starts. Your harmless little chatbot has just become an agent that can actually do things in the world. And that changes absolutely everything.
This leads us to the core question of this entire explainer. And it really reframes the whole safety debate. The question isn't whether the model is good or evil. It's a much more practical engineering problem. Once an agent has these powers to read, to remember, and to act, what are its specific weak points? Where exactly is it vulnerable to being hijacked?
And the answer, it turns out, is a lot more specific than just misalignment. The real attack surfaces are the interfaces, those connection points between the agent and the outside world. We're talking about the untrusted content it reads, the tools it uses, the memory it taps into, and the permissions it's given. These aren't abstract concepts. They are very real, very concrete architectural vulnerabilities.
So let's look at the first major threat that the post unpacks: indirect prompt injection. This is a wild concept. An attacker can actually hide malicious instructions inside what looks like a totally normal piece of data, like an email or a PDF. So when your agent goes to read that document, maybe to summarize it for you, it instead executes those hidden instructions, completely ignoring its original goal. The data itself becomes the weapon.
And this isn't just a theory. The research here really lays out the foundation for this kind of attack. The big takeaway is that you can never, ever fully trust external content. Every single piece of data an agent pulls in has to be treated as potentially hostile, because it might just have the power to change the agent's behavior from the inside out. Okay, the second critical threat is something called memory poisoning. Now, a lot of these agents use a method called Retrieval Augmented Generation, or RAG, where they pull information from a knowledge base to ground their answers. But what happens if an attacker manages to sneak bad information into that knowledge base? Well, the agent doesn't just give one wrong answer. That poison gets absorbed into its memory, and it can lead to flawed or even malicious decisions over and over again.
This brings us to a really key insight from the research. We tend to think of memory as this incredible capability that makes agents so much smarter. But it's also a huge liability. Every piece of information an agent saves or retrieves is a potential attack vector. The memory system itself becomes a massive vulnerability.
So when you start thinking about these new kinds of threats, our old mental models for safety just start to fall apart. Simply adding "be safe" at the end of a prompt, that's brittle, it's easily bypassed. Filtering bad outputs, that's just a band-aid. It happens after the fact and doesn't fix the root cause. And general alignment tuning? It's just not specific enough to protect against these targeted architectural attacks. We need a whole new framework.
And this gets us to the most important insight from the post. Safety failures don't happen somewhere deep inside the model's brain. They happen at the interfaces, those boundaries between the agent and everything else. We're talking about the boundary between data and instructions, between the model and its tools, and even between one agent and another. That's where things break.
Which leads directly to the central thesis here. Agent safety is not a prompt. It's not a filter you add on at the end. It's an architectural design principle. You can't just bolt on safety as an afterthought. It has to be woven into the very structure of the system from day one, by carefully designing those interfaces and controlling how information flows across them.
So, what does this kind of safety-first architecture actually look like? Well, the post lays out a really clear blueprint built around 6 key principles, or boundaries. You can think of these as the pillars of a secure agent system. Everything from separating trusted instructions from untrusted data, all the way to requiring human approval for high-stakes actions. Let's walk through a few. Here's how some of these pillars work in practice. Trust separation is your frontline defense against prompt injection. It's all about making sure data is never accidentally treated as an instruction. Tool containment, well, that's just the classic principle of least privilege. A tool only gets the permissions it absolutely needs, which seriously narrows the blast radius if something goes wrong. And approval gates create these deliberate stopgaps for human oversight before any big actions are taken. It's really a system of architectural checks and balances.
But this idea of an approval gate raises a super important design question. I mean, you can't have a person approve every single tiny action. That would defeat the whole purpose of having an agent. So where do you draw the line? How do you decide which actions absolutely need a human in the loop?
And the answer, according to the Post, comes down to one thing: consequence. Human approval becomes mandatory when an action is irreversible, when it's financially significant, or when it carries some kind of legal or reputational risk. Think about things like deleting a database, making a large financial trade, or sending out an official company-wide email. This isn't just a technical rule, it's a risk management principle that gets hard-coded right into the system's architecture.
But of course, just building this architecture isn't enough. You have to test it, and you have to test it hard. The Post is really clear about this. A system that hasn't been stress-tested at its interfaces is not a secure system. And that means you have to actively try to break it. You run injection tests, you simulate memory poisoning attacks, you red team your own tools. You have to prove that the boundaries you've built are actually going to hold up under pressure.
And to really make this architectural mindset stick, it helps to look at some of the common anti-patterns, the things you need to avoid. First, stop treating safety like it's just another instruction you tack on to the end of a prompt. Second, never, ever let an agent write to a knowledge base that it also blindly trusts. That is just asking for memory poisoning. And finally, don't just assume that having a few agents debate an idea makes it safer. A truly secure system relies on hard access controls, not the hope that a safe consensus will just magically emerge.
This brings us to the final and I think most powerful takeaway. The second an agent does anything more than just chat, the moment it reads untrusted content, saves information, or acts in the world, safety stops being an option and becomes an architectural necessity. These boundaries, permissions, and approval gates, they aren't optional extras. They are first-class design components, just as fundamental as the model itself. So the question for anyone building these systems is no longer just what can my agent do, but what are the boundaries that make it safe enough to do it?